Okay, so notaries, are you tired? Been a long day? All right, I'm going to try to provide you with some information and also maybe a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of your own document examination, if you will. The field of forensic document examination is more commonly referred to, or people that practice in that field are more commonly referred to as handwriting experts. But it really goes way beyond that, okay? Because we look at virtually any kind of evidence that appears on documents. So it could be evidence having to do with machine printing, like the identification of a photocopier. And believe it or not, an individual photocopier can be identified, and it's identified through its defects. And I'll show you an example of that a little later on. I want to focus on signatures, though, but I kind of want to give you an introduction as to the kinds of things that we deal with. So, forensic document examination obviously involves signature authentication. And basically what that is looking at signatures and the evidence appearing within signatures to determine primarily genuineness or non-genuineness. And then we also look at, obviously, handwriting and hand printing. And many people believe that when they hand print something, when they print something where individual letters are not connected to one another, it's actually a form of disguise, and it's not. Merely hand printing is a different form of writing. So if I'm looking at a hand printed bank robbery demand note, all right, I'm looking for examples of hand printing. I can't use cursive writing because cursive writing is a different form of writing, even though it might be by the same person. Typewriter, printer, and copier identification. So believe it or not, even though you don't see typewriters around that often, we still get cases involving identification of those types of machines. And printers are identifiable. Primarily today, they're identifiable with respect to make and model, but there are some occasions when individual machines can be identified. And one of the means by which mechanical devices are identified individually is defects. So for instance, with typewriters, you have the potential of things like broken characters. So let's say the serif or the crossbar on a T is broken. Well, that would be an identifying feature. It might not lead you to conclude that that particular typewriter can be identified, but when you combine a bunch of features and when you combine a bunch of defects, you can actually identify a particular machine as having produced a particular document. Dating. So we don't do chemical analysis. We don't examine inks and papers for purposes of dating. But there are specialists that do that. There are some things that we can do, though. So, for instance, I'm assuming that everybody's familiar with watermarked paper. All right, it's a manufacturer, basically trademark that's incorporated when the paper is manufactured. And those particular watermarks oftentimes are coded. So there's a visible and observable code on the paper in the watermark. And the reason why paper companies do that is to allow for the determination that paper came from a particular run, a particular point of manufacture. So things like the analysis of the longevity of paper can be determined. So those are the sorts of things that we can look at as well in order to determine, for instance, whether or not a document that is dated or was dated in 2011 actually was produced then. If the watermark code indicates the paper wasn't manufactured until 2020, obviously the date is incorrect. We look at alterations to documents, and this is a big area in the field that I deal with. So they can be any number of things. I will show you an example of one of those situations, but as an example, if you have a document that is, let's say, 20 pages long, and you suspect that there's something wrong with the document, you may find that the 15th page was slip sheeted, was actually inserted into the document. And how would you do that? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could do that. So for instance, you can look at staple holes, the simplest thing that you could imagine. And let's say that you have a document of 20 pages and you find that the 15th page is the only one of those 20 pages that only has a single set of staple holes. The staple hole caused by the staple that's currently binding the document, and then an additional set where every single page contains those two sets except for the 15th page. Well, that would indicate that that 15th page was inserted into a document that had already been stapled. Now, that might not be enough to conclude that the document has been fabricated or altered, but when you combine that with other types of evidence, so for instance, the typeface, the font that was used to produce that 15th page is slightly different, or there is a different printing mechanism that was used. So every one of those 20 pages was produced using a laser printer, and the 15th page was produced using an inkjet printer. Those are the sorts of things that we look at when we're dealing with altered documents. Obliterated writing. Now, just a minute ago, you were talking about some of the rules, and one of those is, well, don't white out information that appears, as a part of your notarization. Well, we look at that sort of evidence to determine what it is that's underneath that whiteout, or if a particular word or series of words was obliterated, was scratched out, what was actually written there. And oftentimes those discoveries can be made. So even though you might redact documents, if you don't do it properly, the information that appears in your redactions can be revealed, and not by any, magical means, but things like infrared and ultraviolet light, which can help differentiate between inks or media and help you to determine whether or not, or if the obliterated or redacted writing can be revealed. Physical match. You have a demand note, and there's been cases like this, a demand note for a bank robbery that was written on a matchbook cover. And the suspect in that particular case has in their possession a matchbook with the ripped cover. Can you match that other piece of that matchbook up to the piece that the suspect had? And that can be done by examining paper fibers and the connection between paper fibers and a number of other types of evidence that might reveal or allow you to make physical matches between documents. And many other kinds of examinations. We look at ink, make ink differentiations. We look at virtually any kind of evidence having to do with documents and changes or alterations to documents, or evidence which establishes that a document is perfectly legitimate, that there's nothing wrong with it at all. So what we want to do is we want to start with something that you must be familiar with, and that's the signature. All right? So signatures are phenomenally great as a means of identification. And why are they so good? Well, because they can do a number of things. They can allow the person who wrote that signature to be identified, certainly, merely by reading the name, and more detailed analysis as to whether or not they actually wrote it. But also, each individual signature that you've ever written or that I've ever written in our entire lifetime is unique unto itself. So you've never in your life written a signature of your own that's identical to any other signature. And why would that be important? Well, because that signature appearing on that document will never be repeated again. So if you have, let's say, a photocopy of a document where a party says, oh, well, the dog ate the original, or the original was lost in a flood. And then you find an original document that has a suspiciously similar looking signature on it. And you compare the two, and you find out that they are proportionally identical to one another. Well, you can say that that photocopy contains a signature that was manipulated onto that document. And it may have been by, the simple act of cut and paste, literally cutting a signature out of paper and pasting it onto a document and then making a copy. Or it could be by a more sophisticated means, like photoshopping. You take a signature and image it onto a document so that it looks, legitimate, and there's no shadow lines or anything else that might cause you to suspect that the document is unusual. And yet, that signature was never actually written on that document. It's a fraudulent document. It's a document that whose credibility is easily questioned if you're able to find that model signature that was used. Because, again, no one writes their signature exactly the same way twice. Now, this is a good example of a cursive signature, which is text-based. It's legible. Anybody looking at that, even though the handwriting is very flourished and quite attractive, it's legible. So you can read it. But then you also have signatures that are a little bit less legible. They're stylized signatures. And sometimes stylized signatures can be even more difficult for someone to recreate, someone to attempt to quote unquote forge. And I'll talk about forgery, but more difficult because there's no baseline. You don't know what letter is supposed to represent what part of the name because the entire signature is illegible. So you're basically following someone else's drawing. A stylized signature can be a very secure signature, but only if it's signed consistently. I don't mean identically, I mean consistently. So signatures are a means of identification, certainly, and verification. They're unique to the writer. They're unique unto themselves, which is an extremely important thing. And that was a very important part of a case in New York City, the murder of Irene Silverman. Irene was a very wealthy Manhattan socialite who was very popular, had a lot of great, wonderful friends, and she was a terrific woman. She donated to many charities. She was well known, and she was wealthy. And there were two grifters, Sante and Kenneth Kimes, that set upon her and ended up murdering her in order to steal from her. And what they were doing in part was trying to get access to her property. She owned a very, very expensive mansion in New York, and they were trying to take that property over by making alterations and changes to real estate documents. And when they needed merely a document with the signature of Irene, they would use basically a cut and paste of a particular signature. And when they needed an original document, they would use a tracing of that same signature. So where did this signature come from? Well, the son in this mother and son grifter team, Sante and Kenneth Kimes, rented an apartment that was within the mansion. And so part of that involved getting a rental agreement. And this was the signature from the rental agreement. Now, this is legitimately Irene Silverman's signature. But what was found after the police arrested the Kimes and seized the property, primarily in their vehicle, were hundreds of copies of this particular rental agreement, enlarged, reduced, to the extent that it could be fit onto documents that they needed to use it on when they were making fraudulent copies. Okay? And when they needed originals, as I said, they traced the signature, which is one form of attempted simulation. And they traced it over and over again from the copies that they had. So part of the evidence that they were seized with were copies of the rental agreement with indentations, impressions caused by that tracing process. And so that was very important evidence in connection with their eventual prosecution. And they also were very, very prolific journal writers. So there were approximately 11 journals that were found in the possession of the Kimes. And those journals basically documented the crimes that they were committing. So, for instance, they were trying to get Irene to leave her home for an extended period of time. And one of the ways that they did it, believe it or not, was pretend to be prize consultants and indicating to her that she had won a prize for a week-long visit to Palm Springs, and that she could take a plane down. They actually had tickets for her, and in that way get her out of the house. In order to do that, of course, they had to introduce themselves, and Sante, the mother of the mother and son con artist team, called Irene and explained to her that she had won this wonderful prize. At that point, though, Irene had become very suspicious of things that were going on around her, and particularly suspicious of her tenant, who was going by the alias of Jeff Feig. And she began to record her phone calls. So one of the recordings that the police got from her home had Sante giving this long speech about how she had won this prize. One of the journals that they found had a complete transcript of Sante's side of that conversation. So part of the prosecution was identifying both Sante and Kenneth as having written these journals. And there were a number of other really significant entries, information that they obtained by basically spying on Irene, when she left the house, when she came back to the house, what kind of activities that she enjoyed, and all the different parts of her life that they wanted to keep track of because, again, they were making this attempt to steal from her. So this was a wonderful example of the uniqueness of a signature. Okay, this signature was used multiple times on fraudulent documents. You could do an actual proportional match to those documents that they simply photocopied, and the tracings were unnaturally similar to this particular signature and didn't contain the kind of natural variation that you would expect to see in a person's signature over a period of time. Both of them were convicted and sentenced to life. Both of those convictions withstood multiple appeals. And the significant thing about that particular case was that it was the first time in New York that a first-degree murder conviction was secured with no body, no forensic medical evidence, and no murder weapon. And a lot of the conviction rested on what was contained in these journals and the connection between the Kimes and this particular signature. So it was very significant. I testified in late 2000 in that case for the New York County District Attorney's Office, and it was a really interesting case. But it's a great example of the importance, number one, of original documents, the significance of the uniqueness of signatures unto themselves, and the importance of what you do is witnessing signatures, establishing that the person who writes the name is actually the person that is presented to you. So, here we go. I want to talk about signatures and forgery. Now, forgery, I don't like that word at all. All right, it's inappropriate for a document examiner to talk about forgery. For a judge, it's absolutely important because forgery is a legal determination. It's not a determination that I make or any other document examiner makes. Forgery implies intent, like intent to defraud. I determine genuineness and non-genuineness, and I might go so far in many cases as saying that a non-genuine signature was the product of someone's attempt to simulate the way the purported signatory actually wrote. And with that information, as an example in a trial, a judge or a lay jury might find that forgery occurred. So forgery really isn't a good word for document examiners to use because it's a legal determination. But what kind of non-genuine signatures can you have? All right, well, you can have non-genuine signatures that are in the natural writing of whoever wrote them. And those can be divided up into two kinds of signatures. Oftentimes, people are authorized to write someone else's name. So, for instance, if a person has a power of attorney, they are legally entitled to sign certain kinds of documents in the absence of the actual person who's supposed to be signing that document. Or it may be that power of attorney is granted because a person has diminished capabilities. Let's say an Alzheimer's patient who has become incapable of making their own decisions, and they have assigned a power of attorney to write for them. And typically in those kinds of signatures, what you'll get is the natural writing of the person who's preparing the signature with the name of the individual. But then underneath, it'll say something like POA or power of attorney, and the actual person who's writing will sign. But sometimes you get into situations where people will sign things with authorization, and there's no crime that's been committed. A husband and wife, and the husband and they have individual bank accounts, and the wife needs to get some cash from her husband's account, and he's away. And he has granted her authorization to write his name. Now, the bank might look at it and not accept it, but if the bank is familiar with that circumstance, they may just accept it. And those are the sorts of instances where there's really no reason to disguise your writing. There's no reason to change, the manner in which you normally write, even though you're writing someone else's name, because you have authorization. There's no reason to do that. But sometimes people will create an illegitimate signature, will write someone else's name in their own natural handwriting because they have no idea how the person writes. They have no idea the handwriting characteristics that exist within someone else's writing. So you might have natural writing with or without authorization. And then another reason why, another circumstance where someone may write a name that they're not authorized to write, but they don't have a specimen, don't have an example to create a simulation from. They want to prevent, thinking in advance, someone from making a determination that they were the writer. So they may disguise their writing. So you have non-genuine signatures that are the product of either natural writing of the person or disguised writing of a person other than the purported signatory. And then you have forms of simulation. And this is typically what I deal with. Instances where people have taken someone else's signature, a model signature, and tried to recreate it on a document. So that can be done by tracing. You take the document, put it on top of another signature, and trace it. Just like the Kimes did with Irene Silverman's signature in instances where they had to have an original signature. So you would trace it. And a tracing is a more accurate way of recreating the characteristics that appear in someone else's writing because you're literally in contact with that signature. You're following a line. So you're less apt to make mistakes in form. You're less apt to make a change in a letter or form a letter in a different way because you're following those lines. But on the same token, you are not writing. You're drawing. You're drawing the signature. And writing typically, and there are exceptions obviously, but writing typically is a natural, fluid, rapid act. When you sign your name, oftentimes you're writing in a very rapid, carefree fashion rather than drawing. So you'll have instances of tracing. You'll have instances of simulation by the use of a model signature where you're doing a freehand simulation, but you're using a model. And then sometimes simulation by memory. The classic example is, oh, I got a bad report card and I need to get my mom's signature on it. I kind of remember the way she writes, so I'm just going to write her name. Okay? That would be an example of simulation by memory. So here's an example of two signatories wherein there was really no effort to simulate at all. The signatures on the bottom of the Bucksteins, Sandra and Stephen, are legitimate. Those are real signatures. And the two at the top are questioned. Signatures that the Bucksteins denied. Well, there's no real consistency in form with those signatures. So the simulator may have employed, the writer may have employed some form of disguise, but the point is that these couldn't be characterized as attempts to simulate. They're just non-genuine because they don't reflect the handwriting characteristics that appear in the genuine signatures. This is a situation where you have an example of a question signature at the top and a few known specimens below. And I just want to point out a couple of things to you. So, as an example, you'll note that in every single one of Aldous Rice's signatures, the formation of the D in Aldous contains a loop. This one doesn't. Okay, that's a straight up and downward stroke. It's a retracing up and down along the same line. You have formations of, let's see, the S formation, where the signature ends at the end of Aldous with a much shorter stroke than all the known specimens. Okay, there's a couple of examples of differences, but the question is, are those differences significant? Right? It's significant differences that allow you to make a determination as to genuineness or non-genuineness, or whether something has been simulated or not. Now, this is unfair right here, because it only shows 4 examples of Aldous Rice's signature. I'm going to look at 25 or 30 or 50 signatures, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make a determination as to what Aldous Rice's natural range of variation is. Now, obviously, I'm limited to the spectrum of signatures that are provided to me. Okay? So I'm limited by whatever I'm given. I certainly can't look at Aldous Rice's full range of variation. I would need every single signature that Aldous Rice ever created in their lifetime. And that would be a daunting task at a minimum. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at a much larger quantity of specimens, and specimens that might show formation of a D without a loop, or a longer stroke on the final letter S in Aldous. And those are, this is, in fact, a genuine signature of Aldous Rice. And this is unfair because it doesn't allow you to see a much wider range of variation that show those characteristics. But what you want to know is a non-genuine signature and determination of non-genuineness is not the product necessarily of whether or not there are similarities. I mean, there's many similarities between our collective writing. If we learned the same writing skills in the same elementary school, or even learned the same writing system. Throughout the United States, many children learn cursive, those that still do, based on the Danielian system of writing. Back in the day, Palmer method was very popular, much more beautiful form of writing, less simplistic, but also harder to teach. But the point is that those particular writing systems have common characteristics, and those characteristics may be shared by large numbers of people. So there isn't any characteristic that appears in anybody's signature that you can truly say is unique unto itself. And the way you identify an individual as having written something is not by the mere presence of differences, but by the lack of any significant differences. Differences which clearly exceed the range of variation that that particular writer has, again, in the spectrum of signatures that are provided for purposes of comparison. So simulation is a drawing rather than a writing, all right? It's slow, tremulous, and what you'll see is shaky line quality, okay, from that drawing process. It'll be subtle, but you'll notice it. Pauses of the writing action, okay? A person is copying, let's say, freehand, and they stop the writing instrument in mid-stroke at an unnatural point to refer to the model, and then they continue to write. Well, that pause is something that doesn't occur in the natural fluid process of the actual person's writing. Unnatural lifts of the writing instrument, okay? A person is going along and doing the same thing, referring to a model, lifts the writing instrument, refers to the model, and then very carefully replaces the writing instrument where that writing line ended, and then continues. Those are examples of things that you could attribute to a drawing. So is retouching. All right. I within my natural writing, I utilize a conventional form of the cursive style, small letter E. But the actual writer has a distinctive connected formation of a capital letter within their signature. And I notice that, and I go back over and I retouch it to correct it, to make it look more legitimate. So there's a number of different things that would point towards simulation. Now, obviously, some of those things are also mirrored in people whose ability to write is affected. So as an example, you'll get tremulous writing, certainly from a person who has advanced Parkinson's disease. Their ability to control their fine motor control is diminished and oftentimes very, very shaky. Well, that's not the product of simulation. It's the natural effect of the illness on their ability to write, on the ability to control motor functions. So you kind of have to know how to look for the difference. And typically the difference is grotesque. So a simulation will be a very fine but shaky line, while someone whose ability to write is affected, the formations of letters, the strokes are much more grotesquely unnatural appearing, when in fact it is part of their natural writing. So when you're looking at a particular writer and you see actions like that, it's important for you to know, well, is your ability to write affected? Are you suffering from anything that would cause you to write in what conventionally would be considered an unnatural fashion? It's important to observe when someone is writing the manner in which they're writing, not merely, having them sign off on something, but keeping an eye on the way that they are writing. Important consideration. And of course, consistency in terms of, let's say, a signature on a real estate document and a signature that is part of a notary journal that are signed at the same time on the same day for the same real purpose. Those are important considerations. Natural writing is typically rapid, fluid, uninterrupted. It may be illegible. You may not be able to read the signature, but it should be moderately consistent. So these are some examples of known genuine signatures of Natalie over here. And the very bottom one is a good example of a signature that has been simulated. And it may be difficult to see. The screen is a little bit small, but if you look at it closely, you'll see a number of different things. You'll see that tremulous line quality. You'll see retouching. Okay? You'll see things like ending strokes that are blunt as opposed to tapered. Okay? Tapering of an ending or terminal stroke is a product of speed of execution. When you're writing rapidly and the pen leaves the paper, the writing instrument leaves the paper, it will trail. Okay? It will become narrower. And that's an indicator of speed. An ending that is blunt, when you have multiple examples of the actual writing of that person and consistently they show speed in the terminal strokes in parts of their signature, that's a cause to be concerned. That's a cause to be suspicious. This is great. Okay, you'll like this. So this is a series of genuine examples of check signatures. One particular check with two signatories, and then a couple of other examples of those two signatories on checks where signatures were signed individually. And sometimes what will happen is a company will demand, if a particular check is written for a large amount of money, the check requires two signatures as opposed to just one. It's a security feature. And so the signatures on the right are non-genuine. They're attempted simulations. Now, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but can anybody give me an idea as to a hidden, but once you know about it, very obvious characteristic of those non-genuine signatures that would cause you to be suspicious that they're non-genuine? Anything at all. Shoot a hand up. Take a chance. Anybody? Well, okay, yeah. I mean, you do have this large loop, and it does look a little odd in those signatures. And that's a product of simulation. Describe it.
It's like they made the same, it's like they traced it. They kept doing the same circle over.
Right. They're unnaturally close to one another.
Yeah.
You know? Well, okay, so you just pointed out something that's very, very significant. Okay? This pair of signatures was the model that was used to create those signatures. And why can I say that? Okay, because of a difference in ink that might be difficult from where you're sitting to see. But do you see? Here's my little thing. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. You see this right here? Okay, and you see this? And this? And this? Those aren't part of the signature. Those are X marks by a teller in a bank saying, I looked at this signature. And this right here is the teller's initial. The person who created the simulations only had a copy of that check. And they didn't realize that there was two different inks. So what they did is they incorporated the teller's writing into their simulations, not actually part of the writing. So even simulations are subject to the possibility that someone makes a mistake in error, makes a mistake in form, okay? In this case, it's form that was never actually part of the signature. But when you're trying to simulate something, particularly in a freehand simulation or a simulation based on memory, you may not be as accurate as you think you could be. You only have one chance. There's one document, all right? You might practice it multiple times, but when you're doing that document that you're going to use, the potential for making an error is still there, okay? So that is why simulations are not just dependent upon line quality, tremulous line quality, unusual lifts and pauses of the writing instrument, the drawing process, but also they are subject to errors in form. A mistaken way a particular letter is formed. An O that's formed in a counterclockwise fashion when the actual signatory in 25 or 30 specimens shows every single O written in a clockwise fashion. That's a mistake that could easily be made by someone who didn't know. So in this particular case, you have someone else's writing completely that was incorporated into a simulation. But you may also have characteristics that are just simply errors on the part of the person who's creating a simulation. So I want to talk a little bit about machine-produced documents, but before I do that, I want to thank you, okay? I want to thank you very much for following standards. The rules that are impressed upon you in the function that you are performing as a notary, because notarizations are extremely important. Why are they important to a document examiner? Because let me tell you, I've looked at lots of notarized signatures that are non-genuine, that were not written by the person that they purport to be. So why are they important? Well, notarizations, for the most part, are very legitimate. They're legitimate witnesses to the act of another person putting pen to paper. And that is critical in many instances in my work. Now, I talked about known genuine specimens and the importance of having them. Well, what I don't want is to have an examination muddied by the presence of signatures that are presented to me as known and may not be actually there, may not be actually legitimate. Or signatures that cannot be, where a foundation cannot be asserted. So when a judge looks at a problem like this, and a document examiner is going to be presenting evidence based on a certain spectrum of known specimens, the judge, the fact finder, wants to be sure before those specimens are admitted into evidence that they have some kind of foundation. Well, what's a good foundation? A notarization. That lends legitimacy, it lends credibility to the document, because in typical cases, you have an unconnected person, the notary, witnessing a person signing. There's a great deal of credibility to that. That's a good foundation. And when you accompany that with the presence of a notary log that contains another signature of that same person signed on the same day, the date, the document that was signed, and all of the other components that go into preparing a correctly made log, then you have a really solid piece of evidence that that signature is a legitimate signature, especially if it's completely unconnected to the matter which involves a question signature, whether that signature is notarized or not. So your function actually is critical to my work, because many of the documents that I use for purposes of comparative analysis are documents which are notarized because they have a good foundation. They have a witness, a person who actually saw the person sign. Now, there's many other types of documents that I can use. So, for instance, on an individual checking account, where there's no allegation someone else is writing checks for this person, a series of checks. They have a business foundation, right? They went through the banking system to pay innocuous payees, like the power bill or the cable bill, and the bank accepted them and went ahead and gave the money to whoever the account holder, whoever was on the check. So they have a good foundation too. But a really clear foundation is a notarized document, a document that has been witnessed. And so when I go to my bank and I have, let's say, an affidavit notarized, and the notary at the bank whips out that log, it makes me smile, because this is a notary doing the job the right way. And it's so important that that job is done the right way. We depend, in my field and throughout forensic science, on standards, the recipe for how to do something the right way. So you are less apt for an error to occur. Well, your standards are the way you go about doing the job that you have correctly and following those rules. Are mistakes going to happen anyway? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not immortal. I can make a mistake, but I strive to follow the standards so the chances of my making an error are significantly reduced. And you're doing the same thing by performing each one of those mundane tasks that kind of make doing a notarization a pain in the butt. But they're important, they're significant, and they're significant to do every time. Every time. What scares me most are instances where you have a notary, let's say, who has an employer, and that employer puts pressure on the notary to push away those rules. It's my buddy, I know his signature. We just notarized this. He signed it. He's down in Mexico, and he's unavailable. It's a mistake. And while it may be completely innocent, it provides a means by which people can create bad documents and lend credibility to those bad documents. So that witnessing is extremely important, and that's why I say thank you, because you help provide me with credible material that I can use to then compare against other signatures that maybe aren't so credible. So anyway, other parts of document examination. So I mentioned typewriting, and typewriting is a good example because there are more defects that are going to occur with a typewriter than there are with just about any other mechanical printing device, all right? Any kind of mechanical printing device. So your notary seal may be identifiable individually, so that anybody attempting to recreate that seal can't do it, because it incorporates hidden defects that maybe you don't even know about. Out of use, out of wear, all the different things that can occur to a piece of metal when it's used a lot. Same thing with typewriters. So in this particular instance, you have a number of features, like, for instance, the broken serif on the bottom of the A here, okay? the broken serif on the W. And when I say serif, that's that horizontal bar that goes across the top. So if we take a look at examples, whoops. Okay, so this is the same group of letter forms. This is what the letter looks like when it's pristine, when it's unaffected and undamaged. And so you have these characteristics in a known specimen of a particular machine and an anonymous letter, for instance. Broken serif on the bottom of the A. Broken serif at the top of the W. The shortened or blunt serif on the Y. Broken side of the E right here. A little bit more difficult to see. Broken serif on the V. All right. But just like handwriting, defects can occur and be common even though they're not the product of the same machine. So you have, what seems to be a collection of defects that occurred with this particular typewriter, or what you believe is the same typewriter, and yet there are also differences. And those differences are critical to whether or not you can say it came from the same machine or not. So in this particular instance, we have examples like the serif on the M, where you have a difference between the known specimen and the anonymous letter. And then it becomes a matter of, well, could those defects have occurred between the product of those two machines? And yes, that's possible. But if you have an example and a questioned item that are dated quite close to one another, then no. Now you can say, not the same machine, different machine. Alterations or changes to documents. So in this particular instance, you have a retainer letter that was prepared for a criminal case. And the retainer letter has a notation at the very bottom. And it says basically, we agree to represent you for your criminal case, but if there's ever a civil case that comes down the road after that that's related, this retainer does not cover that. All right? Well, the person who signed off on this engagement letter later wanted to sue the authorities for false arrest. And she wanted the same law firm. So what she did is produce a copy of this document, okay? But on the copy, no notation. All right? How do you prove that? How do you prove what happened? Which is legitimate? Was the notation put on there well after the execution of the document? Or did she do something to her copy to change it or alter it? And the answer is that she altered it. And how do we tell that? Okay, so first, you have what we refer to as trash marks. Now, this is going to be real difficult to see, but trash marks are also the product of defects, and typically the product of defects caused by dirt or dust on a photocopy machine. So you know the glass plating, if you're making an individual copy, that you put the sheet down on? Well, if there's dust or dirt or anything else that is on that glass plate, and let's say even a scratch in the glass, that's going to show up in the copy. All right? And we refer to those as trash marks. So you got trash marks that are common between both. And there were more than just these two, but as examples, these and others allowed us to say, okay, well, they were produced on the same machine. There was a sufficient configuration of trash marks on both that allowed us to say that they were the product of the same machine, because trash marks are transient. They move. Housekeeper comes in and cleans the glass. You remove the trash marks. So not only can we say that it's the same copier based on the constellation of trash marks, but we could also say about the same time, because those marks which are transient are maintained in that copy. So this makes it a little bit easier to see, but this is on the letter that contains the notation, and you can see those two examples, and there were more, and you need more. You want a constellation of trash marks, like looking up at the sky at stars. And then the same constellation appeared on the question one that didn't contain the notation. So you have a set that were present on both. But you also have a set that are present on the questioned agreement that has the notation and are not present on the one that doesn't contain the notation. And why would that be? Well, the potential is that a piece of paper was used to cover up the notation, at the same time covering up the trash marks. So you got these trash marks that are present on the agreement that has the notation and are not present on her copy of that agreement, and others. Okay, but I also want you to pay close attention to that lowercase or small letter t in the word representation. Okay, here's the question one on that same side, the one that doesn't contain the notation. You don't have the trash mark, but you have the very, very top of that letter T that she didn't quite cover up. And it's in exactly the same position where that T comes to its apex. So we can say that they're connected. So what she did was just simply take a sheet of paper and cover up the bottom part that had the notation and then present the copy. Well, this is the copy that I got from the attorneys. Well, no, it isn't, because it contains relatively innocuous hidden evidence that should be there and is not there, or in the case of the T, is present and shouldn't be present. That was kind of an interesting case, and it's a good example of fabrication, utilizing a copier in a very rudimentary way of doing it, just simply covering up the area of the document that was of concern, and then presenting it as being legitimate. Okay, we also use a lot of specialized instrumentation. I was describing things like ink, but indentations can be really important as well. So indentations are impressions on paper caused by typically writing on the previous sheet. So let's say you have a will that's 30 pages long, and the will contains a signature or a set of initials on every single page. Those initials, if the document is bound together, are apt to cause indentations on each successive page. When I look at a questioned will, and I look at a fair number of questioned wills, and I see that every single page has been marked in some way by the person who supposedly the will refers to, it lends credibility to that document, and for a number of reasons. Especially if there's a full signature on the margin of every single page. Why? Well, because in just about every jurisdiction I'm familiar with, that's not required. You're not required to do that. You're required to sign at the end and have it notarized. So if there's a signature on every single page, a person creating a simulation is going way above board and greatly increasing the chance of being discovered because of the multiple signatures that they're creating. Why would a person do that? They wouldn't. So a document like a will that has signatures full signatures on the margin of every single page is a document that has some credibility just on face value. But the other thing is, I was talking about page substitution before, the staples. Well, the beauty of indentations is that it's hidden evidence. So let's say you have a document, a will, that's 20 pages long, and the person signing the will, has signed in the margin of every single page. What those signatures are going to do is cause indentations on the next page. Well, let's say you decided, well, I'm just going to change one page of Aunt Hattie's will, and I'll do my best to create a simulation on that one page. So that's done. The will is slip sheeted, is stuck in, is replaced, But the problem is that the signature that appears on the margin of that page is not going to be the one to cause indentations on the following page. It's going to be the actual signature was written on that page. So it's a great security feature. Doing initials is good. Initials, obviously, because they're a smaller form of writing and less complex, typically, are not quite as secure as doing a full signature. And that's a lot to ask somebody to do. You certainly wouldn't want to have someone write their signature on the margin of every single page and have every single page notarized. But the presence of those signatures is significant because, again, it lends credibility to the document. And one of the reasons why is hidden evidence like indentations. So we can look at indentations using something that's called oblique lighting. And this is basically oblique lighting. A little bit difficult to see, but there are indentations of a line right here. Okay. And the problem with oblique lighting is, unless there's a lot of pressure, the indentations are going to be very difficult to see. Okay, and you may not be able to ascertain that the indentations came from a particular body of writing on a connected sheet. You may be able to say, yes, there's indentations of writing there, but I can't tell what the source is. So we have a device that's called an electrostatic detection apparatus, or ESDA. My wife likes to refer to it as Edna, because Edna is my other girlfriend. So anyway, ESDA, which is the device pictured down in the bottom corner, is rather simplistic but kind of cool, because what it does is similar to what you would do with a gravestone rubbing. I don't know if you've ever, in maybe elementary school, gone to a graveyard and done rubbings so that you have basically a picture of the face of the gravestone. It's kind of a cool memento. Well, this sort of works that way. So in a non-destructive fashion, an ESDA test is where you take a sheet of paper and you place it on a porous metal plate, and you draw basically what is like a sheet of saran paper, clear plastic paper, over that. The plate, because it's porous, has a vacuum that sucks that document down. So it's completely flat on the plate and also seals up the plastic around it. You pull out any creases that are there, all right? And then you would give the plastic an electrostatic charge. There's actually a corona that you pass over the document, like a magic wand, except this is actual physics. And that gives that plastic an electrostatic charge. And then you take material called cascade toner, which is small pellets, tiny, tiny little pellets, like grains of sand, impregnated with material like a photocopy toner. And you lift up the metal vacuum plate that's on a hinge, and you pour this material down the plastic. Now, it doesn't do anything to the original document. Well, what happens is the combination of the vacuum and the electrostatic charge causes these particles of toner-like material to attract into the indentations. So you get this mess that you have here on the left, all right? And these are all indentations that appeared on a medical record, okay? And then what you need to do is take that and try to match those indentations up with indentations from other pages within the record to determine, for instance, whether or not somebody wrote something else in, whether something is absent that should be there, things like that. But with the simple case of page-to-page comparison of indentations, like on that 20-page will, you run an ESDA test, and you'll get a clear picture of each signature that appears in the form of indentations on each following page. And because ESDA is quite sensitive, you'll get multiple images of signatures. Let's say if you're doing the 4th page of that document, you'll get in gradually more dense imaging, a signature from the 1st page that's quite light, signature from the 2nd page, a little darker, signature from the 3rd page, which is quite clear because it was the page that was in direct contact. And that can be very important evidence, again, in terms of looking at things like page substitution and document fabrication. We also use devices to allow us to compare inks. So the classic example is somebody who takes a $100 check and turns it into a $1,000 check by altering the numerical figures, adding a 0, okay? But they mistakenly do it with a different writing instrument than the original writer did. And what you'll do is be able to make a differentiation between those two inks visually. Not chemically, visually. Chemically is always going to be more accurate because it may allow you to identify the ink manufacturer, it may allow you to do relative dating, it may allow you to do a number of other things. But it is absolutely definitive evidence that 2 writing instruments, 2 writing inks were used. And that can be extremely important, like, for instance, in the check example that I gave to you. It may be important in a case of a altered medical record where information was added later on. So one entry in that record that was supposedly written in one sitting actually has 2 different inks. Well, typically when you're writing a single notation for a particular day, in the midst of that notation, you don't put one writing instrument down and pick up another one. They should all be, the ink should all be consistent. So you can also do things like reveal obliterated writing. Of course, this requires that the inks are different, okay? Not necessarily the same color, but different chemical formulations that react differently under different kinds of ultraviolet and infrared light and filtering. And you will actually get stark examples like this, where you literally, you have something that you absolutely cannot read, and examining it with appropriate equipment can allow you to completely reveal what was obliterated or redacted. So these are some examples of what can be done. And how do we do it? Well, we do it with a device called a video spectral comparator. Lots of acronyms: ESDA or EDNA, VSC, or my wife likes to call her Vera. She's my other girlfriend. VSC is a self-contained device that allows you to examine documents from a computer screen, okay, utilizing all different kinds of ultraviolet and infrared light, different levels of those lights, as well as filtering. And you can run through an entire gamut of filters and lights to try to determine if inks react the same, or if you're able to reveal something that has been obliterated. So VSE is another important component in the area of forensic science that I practice in, and allows you to make these kinds of determinations. It also allows you to look at hidden security features of documents. So I have a court appearance in the Bronx, New York on Monday night at 11:55. I'm on a flight over to Greece. Well, what am I going over to Greece for? I'm going to go over to Greece to take a look at some bearer bonds to determine whether or not they have the correct security features to determine whether or not they're counterfeit or not. Now, I'm also looking at signatures in that particular case, but the point is that this equipment is extremely important to allow me to do my job. So there's some stuff, looking at signatures and determining genuineness or non-genuineness is not rocket science. There's no such thing as expert eyes. You can do it as easily as I can do it. The difference between us is that when I'm looking at signatures based on both experience, the education that I've had, I know what to look for. And once I find what I'm looking for, whether it is evidence to allow me to say that a signature is genuine or is not genuine, is stuff that I can not only explain to you so that you can understand it clearly, but is also information that you can see with your own eyes. So it's a very visual field within physical match, the area of forensic science that I'm part of. And it's an interesting thing to act as an expert witness in a case involving, let's say, a questioned signature, because I can't just walk in and say, okay, well, I've been certified in this field since 1990. I come from the oldest forensic document examination practice in the United States. I have 41 years of experience. I've testified in excess of 300 times, all right? That might be great for a toxicologist who's going to talk about whether or not the powder in the bag was cocaine or not. Because the average lay juror doesn't have a lot of experience with chemical compositions and the analysis of chemical compositions. So in those cases, oftentimes a jury has to depend on the credibility of the individual expert. Not so with this stuff, okay? I can talk about qualifications. But at the end of the day, the thing that matters is whether or not a lay jurist, a person who is listening to a case, criminal case, civil case, whatever the situation may be, or just simply a judge, can see the evidence, can listen to my explanation, and clearly understand what I'm talking about. When I do pretrial preparation with an attorney before I appear, the one thing that I say to the attorney is, hey, look, unless you completely understand what I'm talking about, unless the things that I'm talking about are clear to you and you can see them, then we're going to have a problem here, because I would not have been doing my job. And it's a wonderful area of forensic science, because every time I appear in a courtroom, part of that work is education, is talking, just like I'm talking to you, about things that happen with signatures, just as an example, all right? The basic concept of, hey, I don't understand how you can do what you do, because every time I sign, it's different. Well, yeah, it is different, because every signature is unique unto itself. They may have multiple similarities, but every single signature is unique. So what we need to do is we need to divide this problem up. What parts of this signature are significantly different from the range of variation of a bunch of knowns, and what parts of this signature are complex and highly consistent and therefore significant similarities. And those are important pieces, but pieces that, as I'm talking to you right now, you can understand. You know that about your own writing. So it's part education, but part logic, thinking about stuff that you might take for granted or might not even think about, but once it's explained to you, you understand and you can be clear on. So the toxicologist has limitations to what they can say to get a jury to understand. The document examiner is literally required to provide evidence that's fully understandable. And a judge will say to a lay jury, look, this guy's coming in, I'm going to accept him as an expert. I'm going to allow him to testify, because I think his qualifications are are good. I think that he has appropriate qualifications. But you're the fact finder. You will determine whether or not what he's providing is credible or not. You will make that determination. So what he has to say, if you don't believe it, if you're not convinced, you can completely ignore it. I had the advantage in a courtroom of being able to do something that other people in courtrooms can't do. I can express an opinion, but it is that. It's an opinion. So I have to convince you, if I'm able, that my opinion is the correct opinion, because at the end of the day, you're going to make the decision. So, notarization. I said thank you, but these are the kinds of things. A notary is required to keep a fair register of official acts. A fair register would include, and these are the standards, a record of the name and address of each person coming before the notary, the date when they appeared, the method by which each person was identified to the notary, the type of official act, whether it's an affirmation or whatever the case may be, the type of document involved, an affidavit, a deed, a mortgage, the fee that's charged, and the signature of the person that's signing the document in the notary log. Those are your standards, and they're great standards. It's a recipe that you follow to avoid inaccuracy, to avoid errors that could mean a great deal of money to someone, or could mean somebody goes to jail that shouldn't be there. It can get that serious. So your job is dramatically important, even though as you do it day to day, you might not think of it that way. You might think of it as a mundane task. It's not. It's extremely, extremely important. I talked about standards. We have standards in our field that are published. The Scientific Working Group for Document Examination, which I worked on in the early 90s to about 2000, culmination of document examiners that got together and with government funding, established a series of standards. Those standards were eventually published by the American Society for Testing of Materials, ASTM. ASTM is a standard development organization that publishes standards for everything from the viscosity of motor oil to how document examiners do their work. But over the course of time, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, which is an arm of the U.S. Department of Commerce, became involved to incorporate a larger number of people in the process of creating standards. So it's not just document examiners anymore. It's document examiners that are private, that work for the federal government, that work for state governments, that work for local governments, but it's also judges, attorneys, both prosecutors and defense attorneys, statisticians, academia. So we have this whole huge number of people. And as a matter of fact, when we meet, and this is not just document examination, this goes across forensic sciences. When we meet, we actually have to meet in two separate groups. Every single meeting is 500 people. And we meet in different parts of the country. And what we do is we sit down in subgroups according to our specialty, and we discuss, review, and eventually publish standards that are accepted by everybody. Okay? That's the important thing, is consistency. I adhere to these standards. This is what my field has developed. They may be wrong, but standards are reviewed as a matter of the normal course. Okay, there may be things about what notaries do that over the course of time, the powers that be decide need to be reorganized, need to be reviewed and improved potentially. And we do the same thing. And so the NIST administrates the organization of scientific area committees. That's part of the work that I'm doing right now through NIST. I'm on a subcommittee for document examination. We look at standards, we revise them, and we publish them. And they are published now through what's called the Academy Standards Board instead of ASTM. That's part of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. But here's the cool thing. Okay? Part of the stuff that the judiciary and the bar want is transparency. No more secrets. There's no more secret, ways of going about things. So standards not only have to be thorough, well thought out, have, consistency in terms of result, but they also have to be available for free to anyone. So that if I'm testifying in a criminal case and the defendant's attorney wants to know, well, how are you supposed to do what you're doing? He can go online, go to the Academy Standards Board site or the SWGDOC site, Scientific Working Group for Document Examiners, and read how this is done. So there's a standard for the examination of handwritten items. It includes all handwritten items. But there's also a standard for the examination of indentations and a standard for conclusion terminology. How do we talk about our conclusions? What definitions are there? And it's very important, that transparency, because it makes the courtroom a more even playing field for both sides in a case, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case. And that transparency is extremely important. You want to be fair, you want to be neutral, you want to be transparent. And that's part of the work that we do with NIST and the American Standards Board. These are just a couple of books. If you're interested in reading more about document examination on the web, there's a number of sites. ASQDE.org, that's the organization that my great-grandfather founded and is still quite active. We just had our 85th, I believe, annual meeting in August. And it was attended by people from all over the world. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences, instead of focusing on one particular forensic science, focuses on a whole bunch of different forensic sciences. And that's a great site to visit too if you're curious and maybe want to know if that show that you saw on NCIS or Forensic Files actually, is that the way you actually do it? Scientific Working Group for Document Examination is starting to retire, okay, but they still maintain a site, and they include on that site the updated standards, and that's for free. Go on there, you can get the standards, PDF format, read them to your heart's content. And then finally, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their site will provide you with the most updated standards and the recipe for how we do what we do. And is that recipe important? Yeah, and I refer to it as a recipe because if you are baking a cake and you replace salt with sugar because they look the same, your cake's not going to come out very well. So I very much appreciate you listening to me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
Comment and a question. First, comment just your curiosity. They're about writing signatures. When I teach, I have classes on the progression of what a signature looks like way back, down when I get to 1948, give or take a day or two, I talk about an article written by the document examiners in the Women's Bankers Association about new technology that is destroying the real property industry as we know it, and the record keeping ability of that industry. And I asked my audience, what was it? It was the ballpoint pen. Quite fascinating. Quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Every new technology brings, something new to the table and has the potential of destroying some thing that we do.
That's the segue to the next question. Have you had any experience with examining signatures which are made, typically a personal signature on an electronic signing pad?
I was just going to bring that up, so thank you very much. So digital signatures, and a digital signature could refer to a PIN, but what I'm talking about is a digital signature where a person actually takes a writing instrument and writes on a pad, okay? You do it when the UPS comes and delivers your stuff, but the pad is really kind of lousy. It's not going to do a very good job. But the same thing is true oftentimes when you go to some stores. very poor technology doesn't record what needs to be recorded. But the point is that because signatures, again, and I'm an advocate, I love signatures, I love handwriting, but because it's such a significant act, such a significant human act, it allows identification that is unique unto itself, attributed to one person, okay? You would think, oh my God, all this new digital stuff, it's going to end the signature. Well, no, because, I can do an iris scan on somebody who's unconscious. I can take a fingerprint off of a dead body, but I can't get a dead guy to write his name, okay? So, technology, okay? Signature pads. And the fact that you brought that up was great, because I just did a workshop this August on digital signature technology. It was the third workshop I took. It was conducted by a guy, Nico Kalantzis, who is a Greek document examiner who is actually, coincidentally, going to meet me over in Greece and work on me, so I don't have to bring all my equipment over there. He's got the equipment. But anyway, Nico is a phenomenal expert in digital signatures. And you know what's cool about digital signatures? Okay. You would think, oh my God, digital signature signing a UPS pad. No, I'm talking about a digital signature on a good quality pad. Remember I talked about speed of execution, the drawing process as opposed to the writing process? Well, I can look at a signature and I can say to you, that signature was written off in a rapid, fluid manner, because I can see evidence of that. But can I put a number to it? No. I can't tell how many miles an hour that writing instrument was moving. With a digital signature, you can put a number to it, because a good quality pad is going to give you that information. That will give you information as to how rapidly that writing instrument was moving, where that writing instrument was stopped, where that writing instrument was picked up. It will even track the point of that writing instrument up to 1/4 of an inch off the surface of the pad. So I can not only describe evidence of rapid fluid execution, I can put numbers to it. I can give you a number. I can take a bunch of electronic signatures that are known to be genuine and a question signature and say, these were all written at this speed, and this one that's in question was written with a much, much slower speed, and put a number to that, which is great. And you would think, oh my God, that's going to change the entire dynamic of looking at writing. But no, it actually gives us more information, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, technology has to catch up with itself. And so, you can't do that stuff with the pad that, the FedEx guy comes. But eventually you will, because the higher quality pads will become less expensive as technology becomes more rampant and wider spread. Things like, electronic pads become less expensive, and the technology that is so significant that I would depend upon becomes available. So thank you for mentioning that.
Important to the audience, notarization is moving into electronic dates.
Yes. No question. And to tell you the truth, there already has been in the United States. Yeah. I will say one thing about electronic signatures, though. The problem with them is they can be replicated on documents. So oftentimes, quite legitimately, you'll have a mortgage that, has to be signed on every single page, and they'll use the same signature. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. The purpose is to have every single page signed individually because of the uniqueness of each individual signature. And so that, it's not just a matter of the technology and catching up, but also a matter of how that technology is used. Can I answer any of the questions? Great. Well, I very much appreciate the hospitality and being able to come down and speak to you. I feel very honored to be the keynote speaker. I'm very honored to have Judge Acosta introduce me. I'll be hanging around for a little bit. So if you do have any additional questions, feel free to just walk up to me and, slap me in the face or something, which I'll probably need after driving 3.5 hours, primarily through New Jersey, which was no easy task. Thank you very much.